I will do a more.
Is there a sign?
Is it unlocked? Yeah.
Did you put a sign in our classroom?
No, why should I have to do that?
I have no idea where it was. Do you want me to run down there and put one?
That's where John just went.
Oh.
So, no, we're only sending one. Anyway, I'll give a more formal introduction to Brian Doyle after reading. I wrote it out and everything. But here he is, and you've read this book. And would you like to start with a few words and then we'll ask questions? Everybody's got some good questions for you.
Okay.
So you don't have to prepare much. You can just riff off what we say.
Yes, please. Let's see. A, thank you. I mean, you don't know me from hole in the wall, and I don't know you from hole in the wall. We'll probably never see each other again. So I always want to begin by being respectful. Thank you very much. You've read my work. I take it as a great compliment. I'm not wise or authoritative. I'm just a guy, just a storyteller like you are. So thank you very much, first of all. Second, my nose has been busted 3 times, twice by my brothers, once by a 2x4. I have a nasal mutter, so sorry. Sometimes I sing and chant and curse, sorry. And I always, even visiting in class, I get nervous in the beginning. So let me start out, can I read a couple little pieces and then we can just talk, okay? Also, I tend to get, start running off the mouth and getting excited and stuff, and it becomes very fascist, so you gotta stop me. If you wanna, we get a little time together, so don't let me run away with it, okay? Stop and ask questions, tell me what you think, and tell me to buzz off, it's okay, all right? That's it, I do want to talk about stories, that's all I want to talk about today, story, 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 story. Let me read a piece just out of respect, let me give you something before I possibly give you nothing. So, I'll tell you what, one of the things I've been absorbed with over the years, especially lately, is just voices, the way that people tell stories, right? Much of what you learned in 5th grade about how to tell stories is a lot of nonsense. Come on, sit down. My name is Pat Madden. This is Brian Doyle.
Oh, dang it!
Going over the work of Kierkegaard. We have a test. Okay, take coats off. Okay, shoes off. Anyway, let me start. Let me start with just by reading you a story. One of the things I'm absolutely convinced of is that look, we swim in an ocean of stories. There are stories swimming all around you all day long, like the most beautiful and shocking fish. And your job as a writer is mostly just to grab them as they go by. There are more stories you can possibly tell in 100 lifetimes. That's the way it is. So one of the things that you should learn as young writers is it's the paying attention that's the crucial piece of the job. Everything else is craft. Craft is easy. Craft you can work on. Craft you get better at. Craft Pat can help you with. Okay? It's attentiveness that's hard. And that's your job. And that's your job in every aspect of your life. Love, citizenship, it's attentiveness that matters. Okay? So let me just read your story. So one of the things I've tried to do in recent years, especially as I've become ancient, is to just listen better, to be a little quieter and listen better. How ironic that I'm telling you this. So, but here's the story. There's a story of the guy who works at my campus. No Van No is a brief man with one eye and one foot. He's a mechanic here at the university. He can fix anything and has done so for 6 years. He was born in Vietnam. When he was 18 years old, he sat for the National College exam. Students who passed the exam went on to university, and students who failed went into the Army. He failed the exam and went into the Army. His Army was at war. One day he stepped on a landmine and lost his left foot and his left eye and most of his right eye. Then the other Army overran his Army, and that was the end of the war. Former sergeants in the wrong Army were not popular with the new government, he says. And there wasn't much work in the new Vietnam for blind, one-legged men, of which there were thousands of us after 30 years of war. And I didn't want to lean on the largesse of my family. So I applied to immigrate, and that was denied. My sister tried to buy me a spot on a boat, but her money was stolen. So I concluded to escape, he says. I decided to cross the border into Cambodia, he says. This is 1975. He's escaping from Vietnam into hell. My father and I cried. I sold all my clothes. All I had left was shorts and a shirt and cigarettes and a plastic foot. I took a boat to the border. Some guys showed me where to go. We waited for dusk. They took off running fast through the fields and I followed them. I carried my crutch on my shoulder and ran as fast as I could. We got across the border into Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge were in charge there. I went west toward Thailand. I didn't have any money. A boy in the village was supposed to help me go through the forest, but he left me in the forest, and I got caught by the soldiers. Worries came up through my mind. To escape into Thailand, you needed about $100. Well, I got the money. That's a long story. I'll tell you that story some other time. I was in jail for a long time, in the camp, in the mud. I prayed for good luck. There was only rice soup and salt to eat. Women in the prison where I was were raped every night. Then one day the head of the prison saw me limping and falling in the mud. When he found out I was blind and crippled, he told the soldiers to get rid of me because I couldn't do any work for them. Somehow something happened and I went to the Red Cross, and the Red Cross put me in a refugee camp. Because I'd been in the army when your army and our army were fighting, I could come to your country, which I did. Some people helped me get an eye transplant. When I opened my eye after the operation, everything was very bright. I was very happy to see everything again. I studied to be a mechanic and I met my wife, and we have 2 boys now. They're very intelligent boys. I went back to Vietnam 2 years ago, but no one recognized me. I don't blame them. It was a very long time ago that I was there. A very long time ago. No Van No also told me recently he was driving off in his car from campus. I said, "Where are you going?" He goes, "Going to the foot store." I said, "Run that by me again?" Going to the what? Foot store. I got to buy a new foot. Broke my foot. I said, "Did you find out you broke your foot?" And he goes, "Took my boot off and my foot fell out." So go to the foot store. And it turns out that just by, you know what I mean, I ended up writing another piece because I go, "You know, you can buy a foot. I mean, you can go to an elbow store. There's stores that sell ankles. I mean, you can go buy an ankle." You know? Is that cool or what? So, anyway, somebody said to me, "Oh, you know, I like that piece that you wrote." I said, "Yeah, but you know, in a funny way, I didn't write it. I just listened." So, if you listen hard, there's 90% of writing. So, I'll read another piece later from a book. I have a book coming out next year, A Year in the Life of a Vineyard, which is a very entertaining thing to write, as you can imagine. All I did was ask questions, and people just kept blurting out answers. Yet another tip I want to give to you as writers is, listen, everybody has a million stories, and if you just ask, this is the great, my father finally said to me, you know, the great secret to writing and seduction is the same thing. Just listen. It's like, "Dad, why didn't you tell me that at 20? So, anyway, but everybody has a million stories, and they're itching to tell them. And if you just listen, the respectful listening is so valuable in life, and it's such a key to great writing. If you just listen enough, people will tell you wonderful stories. All you got to do then is just shape them, and that's you get better at that. You know, my father's great rule. My father's a newspaper man. His great rules when I got out of college. He said, "So you're educated. What are you going to do now?" I said, "Well, I'd like to be a writer." He rolls his eyes. "Great. Your sister's a nun. Your brother's a mathematician. Who's going to support the old man?" You know, and he goes, all right. You want to be a writer? Want some advice? I was like, "No, I don't want any advice." I was young and cocky. And he goes, "Well, I'll give you some advice anyway. A, learn to type 60 words a minute or better. B, get a job. C, sit your butt in the chair every day. Sit in the chair every day and type. I don't care what you're typing. Write a letter to your mother and then cross off to your mom." You know. And what's his last piece of advice? Learn to be quiet. Learn to listen. So, and I at the time, it took me 20 years to fully pay attention to what my father was saying, but he was right. So, typing's not a problem for you guys. You guys are young and computer hip. So, okay, now let's talk. Come on. Because otherwise I'll do this all day long. It'll be wicked boring. Well, pretty soon we'll end up singing.
Robbie had a good question. Robbie emailed this question to you.
Which one?
If God is all powerful, can he make a rock without even eating left? This is an old Catholic boy question.
Well, I enjoyed your comments on advice for writing. I actually had a question on the essays that we read, especially for today, like how we wrestles, who we are, and what matters. I was just going to ask about the creation process when you're actually going to create or sit down to write. Do you usually wait to be inspired by a certain thing to write it, or do you sit down and try and think back on past things and think what could be like inspiring or essay worthy, I guess? Like, how do you go about the creating process?
Mostly I am obsessed by something at the moment, you know what I mean? And it's usually tiny. It's usually a little tiny thing. you know, and I guess you know, it's not like I'm masterful or any good at it as a writer, but I try to be, you know, you carry 2 pens for one thing. I always carry a backup pen and scribble down. As soon as, my father used to say, look, the difference between people who are writers and people who are not writers is writers get out of bed at 1 o'clock when they have that cool line that passes through their mind. They get their butt out of bed and write it down, and then work on it the next day. You know what I mean? Little sourdough starters are where things begin. That's a good example. I'm driving the other day. My son's, my elfin daughter is now 14. I'm like 5'10". You know, it pushes me. You know, we're both going to the bathroom. I get shoved out of the way. So things have changed. And then she's in there for a week. It's very interesting. Are you coming out sometime today? Buzz off, Dad! Okay, yes, dear. Anyway, I'm driving the other day with my sons, twin sons, and one of my sons says, hey, Dad, how many girlfriends did you have before Mom? You know, and then it stayed in my mind. I mean, it's a kind of a heavy question when you think about it, you know. But it stayed in my mind. I thought, and so my habit then is to sit down and just sort of play. You know, I sit down and I think maybe it's the beginning of an essay. It turned out it wasn't quite, you know, for me. And so it became a kind of a poem. You know, I don't write poems exactly. They're more like clock moments. But that kind of thing is very useful. Whatever it is for you, often I think for young writers or for newer writers, it's your own life. You know, you're falling in love, you're having your heart broken, you're breaking other people's hearts, you're grappling with your family, you're grappling with your family history, people are dying who you love, you know, your grandparents are starting to disappear, people are vanishing from the world. You're beginning to mill your childhood memories for symbol and epiphany, right? And that's totally normal. This is where memoir comes from. A lot of personal essays begin in your own life, but you must pull the thread and see what happens. You know what I mean? So you can't sit there and wait for inspiration. To answer your question finally, you can't sit and wait. You don't sit down at the typewriter or at the computer and say, okay, hit me, God. You know, it doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. You sit down with little pieces of paper and just play with them and see what happens. Play. You know, so much of essay writing in particular is just play. You know, it's the mind. It's the playful mind at work. And I find, I don't know if this is true for Patrick and other essayists, but I find that often the thing that I end up writing isn't the thing that I began writing. And I sometimes think that kick of fun is where a real essay comes from. You know, what were the pieces? How we wrestle who we are,
And what matters?
how we wrestle. That began in my son. One of my sons was born missing a piece of his heart. You know, a bit of a problem. a little technical problem there. You know, you're supposed to have 4 pieces and you had 3. But I kept playing with that. You know, like, what does it mean? What does it mean? I mean, you know, there's all the technical and logistical and moral and horrible and fearful and prayerful aspects of that. But also, you know, what if? I mean, what if actually human beings do evolve morally as fast as we evolve physically? I mean, what if? You know, what if our hearts hit 7 chambers? You know, would we be cooler? Would we be less violent? You know, so you have to kind of push. You take a fact or a story or a memory and push it, you know, and see what happens. Sometimes it won't go anywhere. That's fine. You know, don't be bummed out if it doesn't. You know, sometimes it changes form. You know, another thing I think young writers are especially kind of wiggly about is, well, I want to write fiction. I think, yeah, well, why don't you just write and find out what it is later? You know what I mean? Maybe it's an essay, maybe it's a poem, maybe it's a short story, maybe it's the nugget of a novel, maybe it's an article. I mean, the form seems to matter less to me than the impulse. You know what I mean? So my sincere advice is, A, sit your butt in the chair and push. Just play, have fun. You know? Come on, I'm going to get all fascist. You know,
I've got a question.
Shoot.
In your essay, How We Wrestle is What You Are, or Was What We Are,
All those little words.
whatever it's called, with the wrestling. There's a part where you talk about a lot of fears and anxieties you had regarding that, and then you talk about how hard that was for you and how, almost like it was like a painful thing that you were writing about. And I'm just curious, like, how you recommend dealing, like, on paper, when we're dealing with something that's like deeply personal, like painful, how do you feel how much you recommend going to it? Matt told me he just doesn't write about stuff like that a lot of times, but.
He's never committed a sin, the poor guy.
But like.
He's from Jersey.
No, I believe you.
Thought there was a
I believe
sin.
that. But like, how do you recommend going about it?
I guess here is partly my age. I can't imagine that you wouldn't grapple with it. You know what I mean? I'm short. So, I mean, I feel it would be dishonest if I didn't say, you know, yeah, I had some dark moments thinking, what if my son, you know, of course, what if he dies? What if he doesn't die? What if he's a wicked cripple forever? You know, am I man enough to be a good father for a son who's totally bent forever? Is it, you know, a deeply crippled child is a different gift. Am I man enough to accept that gift and to see it as a gift? I don't know. You know, I have friends, for example, I think one of the things I want to talk about in the reading is, I have 3 friends who were roasted on September 11th, you know, and I've often thought, and friends of mine were firemen that day, you know, guys ran up, you know, and I've often thought, would I have had the courage to run up knowing I wasn't coming back down? I don't know. But if you can't say that, then you're not getting anywhere in life, you know. I mean, you have to confront your own weakness to get anywhere, it seems to me. So, that's very hard. It's hard to do that. It's hard not to be cool. But I think probably some function of maturity. One of my ambitions is to be grown up someday. And I suspect that the only way to do that is to be honest about how you're not cool. So, I mean, I insist on being cool only to my children, but everybody else says, okay, yeah, I'm a bonehead like everybody else. So, but in that piece, I feel like, I mean, really, the strength of that essay, if it has a strength, is the blunt honesty about fear. You know, I mean, and it would be a weak essay to say, oh, you know, I have faith that God would say, yeah, but you know, that's not enough. I mean, it's not enough. You know, there's a piece. I just wrote a piece called "Sin" about roaring at my son Joey, and there's a twist in it where I say, look, to assume that God forgives is not enough for me. You know, I think my take on it personally as a Catholic is that God is working through people. You know, and you have to be honest. I feel like there's no prayerfulness or no real holy attentiveness or reverence unless you're being really honest about stuff. When you learn this when in love, you guys all know what I'm talking about. You know, the way that you first fall in love is you tell stories, some of them true. You know, and then you learn after a while that you have to just be straightforward with the woman. You can't lie. Otherwise, you're not going to be with that woman anymore. I mean, it doesn't work that way. So, then you come to a sort of mutual negotiation about things. I mean, I think, you know, I've been married for 20 years and I know less about it than I did at the beginning. You know, I was pretty cocky the first year. I was going to write a piece about marriage. Thank God I did. You know. Anyway, yes, sir.
I want to ask 2 questions, but the first is, I mean, you play a lot with language in your writing, and you play with form and you play with structure, and we're debating about this. How much of it is natural, and how much of it is craft? Meaning that you go back and you specifically say, I've got an idea, but I want the language to do more, so I'm going to play with it and work with it and pull the structure so that everything comes together. Or does it all just naturally come out?
Actually, that's a very good question. And apropos for you, I think. In my case, a lot of it is a natural Irish. You know, I mean, I grew up Irish Catholic in New York, so it was swimming in stories, symbol, magic, saga, from a very oral ancestry, right? An oral story. I mean, you know, the Irish didn't write till the year 800, is that right? And we invented Ogham. You know, and so to be Irish Catholic in New York is very much a story thing. So for me, language and playfulness, and I got a funny letter once from a reader who said, "Dear Mr. Doyle, I've read your work for 20 years, and here are your sins: addiction to alliteration, and addiction to run-on sentences. You have a wicked thing for a semicolon, and passionate overwriting," which I thought was the funniest thing. I wrote back saying, "Don't you think passionate overwriting is the best kind of overwriting?" Cordially, which was mean. I should have done it. I guess in my case, probably mostly it's a natural thing. And so my habit when I write a piece is I generally write too much. You know, like I'll, you have fun, and there's long runs of sentences, and I hate commas, that's another thing. My brother once sent me a page of nothing but commas. Dear Brian, you need some of these. Love Kevin. So I write too much, and I advise you to do the same thing. When you're having fun and you're on, and write too much. You can always fix it. You know what I mean? Get it down. Get it down. You don't have anything until you get something down on the page. Okay? Then after that, then you listen for story. You know, then you go up, you read it again and again. When I'm working on a piece, say the next day when I go back to it, I open it up and I read it again from the beginning to listen to it, to see what's happening. You know, and then pieces have certain tones and music sometimes. You know, rhythm and cadence. You'll find the more you write, you'll find pieces have different musics in them. Listen for that, but write too much. Write too much. The pieces should be, your first draft should be twice as long as the finished piece. You know, and then when you think you're done, then go through it and find the story. What's the story? You know, another one of my father's rude comments was, I used to show him I used to write bad fiction, bad poetry when I was young, you know, like everybody. You should, it's an American thing. And I would show it to my dad, and my dad would say very politely, he's a newspaper man, he's kind of blunt. He'd say, right, beginning, middle, end. Beginning, middle, end, I think. The old man's losing it. But he was right. He was basically telling, where's the story? Yeah, this is beautiful and lyrical, but you know, who cares? Where's the story? I need a story. Our brains have little story holes. We're built to accept, we eat the universe in little stories, you know. I mean, you know, we can talk all day long about September 11th. Imperialism and murder and fundamentalism and Muslim moderation and blah, 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 blah. It's all blah until somebody tells you a story. I'll tell 3 stories in that reading today that'll make your hair spin. But that's what we're supposed to do. That's what we do. That's who we are. We're story vessels. You know what I mean? I mean, why is the story of Christ so persistent? Let's be blunt. It's a hell of a good story, for one thing. It's an amazing story. But it's a story, you know what I mean? Maybe we can talk all day long about Revelation and blah, blah, blah. But the stories are what you remember. What did you learn when you were little kids? The little stories that stay in your mind. You know? Your whole family existence is a story. You know? If I was to say to you, tell me in 5 minutes the whole history of your tribe, you would basically tell me 5 stories, right? You would tell, well, as my grandma said, blah, 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 blah. And you know what I mean? The fact is one thing, story is another. But anyway, when you finish with your piece, go through it and find out what's the shape of the story. You know, is it beginning, middle, end? One of the sins, Pat and I were talking about this before, one of the problems with an essay and in your draft is that often it'll go like this. Writer, speaking here as an editor of a magazine, editors call these goiters, and we cut them off. You know, you want a storyline. And it sounds kind of simple and stupid, but beginning, middle, end, yes, you want a storyline. And then another piece of advice is, after you listen to it. Read it out loud. Sometimes that helps. It's not always the case that a piece read out loud is better than, you know what I mean? But sometimes that helps. It'll show you the fat parts. And yet another thing then is look at the verbs. This is a key aspect of your work. There's so many boring verbs. Is, was, felt, saw, blah, boring. You know, it's okay to turn a noun into a verb. It's okay. You know, and often a beautiful passage, a passage that really matters, it turns on just one cool verb. You know, that's one of the things I do after I've had fun and played and worked and blah, blah, blah. I think I'm done. Then I go back in and look at the actual engineering of the thing. You know, remember in 5th grade when you diagram sentences? Remember? The only utility of that all these years later for you is that, yes, the verbs are the little keystones, the little levers of your sentences. And they matter more than anything else in your work. You know, if you're talking about pure freaking craft, look at your verbs. Okay? Remember nothing else from today. So, more questions? Yes, sir.
You gave an interview to Professor Madden, and in it you
I think I
mentioned.
inflicted an interview.
Oh, you inflicted. So in it you mentioned how some of your critics say you're a sentimentalist, and I.
Yeah, the hell of them.
Well, the thing is, I agree, though I don't see sentimentalism as an indictment. You know what I mean? And so if you were to redefine sentimentalism as just the ability to write emotionally, Do you think you're a sentimentalist, and is that a bad thing?
If we define it, if we redefine it as writing with emotion,
Well,
oh, sweet Jesus, yes.
well, what do they define it as? I mean,
I
that's,
think what people, I think that criticism would apply, it's my mom, it means easy emotion, you know, and that is, I think, a venial sin. You know, if your work is, if it's predictable, if, you know, and there's a lot of, I mean, for example, as an editor, I receive a lot of devotional stuff. I mean, it's a Catholic university, Catholic magazine, and a lot of it is predictable. I can see where it's going, I can see the conclusion, it's an easy epiphany, and therefore, you know, God, blah, 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 I think that's not good enough. That's not enough. You know, if it's easy, then it doesn't matter so much. You know what I mean? I suspect this is probably the truth with marriage, you know, is if it's easy, maybe it's not deep enough. You know what I mean? It should be complicated. Life's like that. You know, you should wrestle with moral grapple in your life. If you're not wrestling, for example, with religion, if you don't wrestle with your religion, I wonder if it matters so much to you. You know, if it doesn't ebb and flow, and you know what I mean, then I wonder if it's for real. You know, there's a great line from, you know, the writer Flannery O'Connor, the great, I would argue the great Catholic writer of the 20th century, Flannery O'Connor. There's a great line. She was at Notre Dame, and somebody said to her, "Well, can we talk about this whole Eucharist thing and Catholicism? I mean, you know, you say that, you know, suddenly the bread becomes Christ. I mean, that's really a symbol, isn't it?" And Flannery was very shy, apparently. Spoke up very shyly and said, "Well, I guess if it's only a symbol, I said to the hell with it." Period. And I thought, wow. But that's sort of what so I feel like in my work, yes, I want to be naked emotionally. I want to try to be naked emotionally in a way that's connectable to the person, you know? I mean, your children don't have heart problems, I hope, but you know what I'm talking about in that essay, don't you? You know what I'm talking about. If you're honest, you've had those dark moments at night when you're thinking, I wonder if I'm good enough, you know? I wonder if I'm brave enough. I wonder if I'm honest enough to get there with a woman, to get there within my life, to get there as a citizen, to get there as a person of spiritual reverence. I wonder, you know, you have to be straightforward about that, you know? I mean, you can't accept me as an American citizen. You can't live in a world after September 11th without being afraid and grappling with your own fear, you know? So, sentimentalist, if we redefine it, yep. If it's easy sentiment, I hope I don't do that anymore. I think I did, you know, but anyway. Other questions? Come on. Young ladies, I'll call on you, but help us all. Come on, fringe of the room. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to ask you, like it's a two-part question. What's easier for you to write, beginnings and endings, and do you have any like tips on how to
Geez, another good question, a craft question. I guess beginnings are easy. Although another thing that editors say, did I give you these rules? I did, right? Yes. One of the rude rules of editors is that often a piece really begins on the second page. That I think there's some leftover habit from when we were young, and Pat and I were talking about this before, that we all had those classes in like 7th or 8th grade, outlining your essay, you know, the opening, the text, the conclusion. That's nonsense. You know, but I think often younger writers in particular will take a while. There's a run and get start thing, and then finally the beginning is really a little bit later. The 3rd or 4th paragraph is where the essay really begins. You know, beginnings are fun for me. I write a lot of pieces that don't work. You know, where I start a piece and it doesn't work. Endings. Patrick and I were talking about this before. How do you know when you're done? You know, I guess my general theory is that you're done before you thought you were. You know what I mean? There's the same thing is true at the other end of your essay. I think there's still some leftover volition to say, so therefore, in conclusion, ergo, my essay meant, you should conclude this from my essay. That's all nonsense, you know. You already wrote the essay, for heaven's sake. You don't need to tell me what it was about, right? So, I guess lately I feel like essays that just end are fine. And a sudden sharp stopping is probably a good thing. You know what I mean? If a piece doesn't, if you don't get a little rise at the end of it, maybe it wasn't quite as successful at the end as it should be. You know what I mean? And again, this has to do with story. The stories have shapeliness, right? Beginning, middle, end, and they have ends. So, I guess another piece of advice when you're done with your piece, look at the head and the tail and see if they're really fully necessary. Often I suspect that you'll be able to cut a paragraph off at each end, right? And have a really long sentence in the middle. One of the pieces I want to read today is 2 on 2, which is fun to read. Partly because it's like 600 words, but it's only 4 sentences, I think, right? It's like a 250-word sentence, and then ding, ding, 2 little sentences, and then with a long sentence at the end. And when I wrote that, I had a great assistant editor who was really classically trained in journalism, and she was my first reader, and I gave it to her to read, and she read it, tiptoed into my office, and said, this piece is like 600 words, but it's only 4 sentences. And I said, and your point would be? She tiptoed back out. So, all the rules that you learned before, break them. You know, the only rule is, tell me a story that matters. That's the only rule. Everything else doesn't matter. All the stuff that you learned doesn't matter. Tell me a story that matters. Tell me a shapely story with no fat that matters. That's all. Everything else is guff. So, more questions. Who's this one? Come on, let's ask questions. Yes, ma'am.
This is a weird one, but I think it is like undisputable that we're young writers. So at what point do we reach like authorial maturity? When will we know?
Never. Never. Let me write down never. Really, what's your name?
Kate.
Kate. The answer is never. Never. And but believe me, I've worked with and some of my friends are some of the greatest writers in the world. I've worked with and my friend Peter Matheson. It never ends. It never.
It's not really
never
exactly
confident.
what I'm asking. I guess it is partially like a when do we arrive question, but I think it's constant. Like in another 10 years, you'll really be writing.
No.
Like,
No. Just do it, and you'll look up and you'll be 72 with great grandchildren,
Okay.
and still thinking, geez, I wish I could be a real writer someday. It never ends. I think probably what happens is you develop a certain interior knowledge of your own working habits. That's the one thing that comes with, not with age per se, but with practice. You know what I mean? 10 years from now, you should be much more astute about when your own work isn't working, right? That's the only thing that comes with lots of practice, is that you know what you're bad at and how to avoid it. I hope. I mean, partly that's the question about sentiment and emotion. I think as a younger writer, I was easier at easy sentimentality, and as an older writer, I'm a lot harder on myself to not write crap. So anyway. Okay, back there in the southwest corner. Come on, ladies. Let's talk about. We can talk about Australian football, Van Morrison.
So do you like U2?
Aussie football. Oh yeah, U2. Greatest rock band in the world. other than Springsteen. Just
I'm kind of curious as to like how you write. Like, do you like? Maybe it doesn't follow a pattern. Do you start with the story and then just go off on it? Do you write it like all at once and then come back to it, or do you write it in chunks and then?
No, I write in chunks. I'm trying to think of how things have begun in recent pieces. Let me think. Sometimes pieces I work on, and then they're not quite right, and then I come back to it a month later and poke it open, and then it goes in the right direction. Let me think. I wrote a piece recently called Lost Dog Creek. We had a little dry creek down the end of our street that fills up only in the rainy season. In Oregon it rains like 7,000 inches a year. So, but my kids had different names for it. I realized, and then I got curious. What is the name of that creek anyway? And well, it turns out my one kid called it Notre Dame Creek, and one kid called it No Water Creek. But they had different names, and so I got curious, and then called up the guy who used to be the mayor and said, "What's the name of that creek?" And he said, "Well, it's actually called Lost Dog Creek." I said, "Why?" He goes, "Because I lost my dogs there, and I was in charge of naming all the creeks. I had to name all the creeks on a Saturday. All the creeks in town I had to name on Saturday because the U.S. Geological Survey suddenly said to them, we have these unnamed water sources." And so the piece ends up running away. And then I get really fascinated by, what do the Indians call it? What do the animals call it? Who lived there? And so it often ran. But it's just curiosity sort of where stuff begins for me, and then I just start. I got absorbed, for example. You know what a fisher is? You guys know what? The mustelid family. At the low end is weasels, at the high end wolverines. There's two animals in the middle called marten and fisher. not many of them anymore. You can probably have Martin here, I would guess. They got absorbed by Fisher. It's like the legendary American animal that may or may not exist in Oregon. Nobody really knows. You know, so I get really absorbed by it. And just started calling people, biologists and stuff, and then finally saw one. I couldn't believe it. You know, and, it's the one animal that eats porcupines. They're so fast. They zip in, flip the porcupine over, and so the poor thing's on its back, and then they just jump on top and scoop it out like a melon. So I got really absorbed by that. You know, my wife says, "You're crazy." I guess I just start, and then so I always, another thing I do that may be of use to you is I always have 2 or 3 things going at the same time, because whatever's not working, something else will. It's like having 3 loaves of bread going. You know, one of them is fun, and generally it's not the one you're supposed to do. This is another thing I learned as a writer. the great, you know, David James Duncan, wonderful writer. Oh, God, wonderful writer. Duncan's theory is that the thing that you're supposed to do, that you know you're supposed to do, that you told yourself you're supposed to do, it's number 1 on your to-do list, and you in fact signed a contract to do it, that's not the thing you're going to do. Your brain wants to go to the second thing, default. So whatever, he said, so set yourself something that you're supposed to do. I'm writing a novel, and then you'll have fun writing essays. But if you say, I'm writing the essay, you'll never do it. Then you'll work on the novel. So I think it's very true. So another thing is try to have 2 or 3 pieces going at the same time. You know, and keep going with them. You don't have to do them all at once, but come back to it. The next day, sit down, open up the file, read it through, see if there's another paragraph at play. And often, again, often essays will go like this. You know, when they take that turn, go there. Follow the turn, go there. Go that way. Often the essay turns out to be about the second thing, not the first thing. The thing that you thought you were writing is not where the essay wants to go. Go there. You know, it's not like you're going to lose any money over it. You know, so. Oh, that more. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, you write a lot about your family.
Yeah.
So, I'm just wondering, I mean, do you show this to them when they see it? What do they say? And how does that all play out? Because I get a little tentative to show my family things I've written that have them in it, even if it's good. Even if it's good things I've said about them.
Well, let me be a total hypocrite about it. I sincerely advise you not to write about your family. I wrote a piece once about my wife's father. He had died before I ever met him. And he had dug this, one of the things that fascinated me about him is he dug this pond every year. And every year the creek would fill it up with mud and frogs. I'd get out there in the spring and dig it out again. You know, and I thought, somehow that says something about his character, you know. And so I wrote a piece about him. And I thought this was a really respectful and reverential piece about his courage and character and blah, blah, blah. But I said he had really big ears and gnarled hands. And so 20 years later, I still get ragged on by my wife's family about how I call her father elephantine ears. And, so my sincere advice is no, don't write about your family. And B, if you do write about your family, don't show it to them. It's easier writing about kids because, you know, for a long time my kids couldn't read, so the heck with it. Somebody asked me this. One of the things, I love visiting grade school classes because they ask me the most haunting questions. And one kid said to me, well, don't you think it's kind of unfair to write about your kids if they're not reading what you write? I said, well, eventually they will, but maybe I'll be dead by then, so that would be good. But I also, her question really was, why do you write about your children? Why do you write about your family so much? And my answer was, because all subjects are inherent in my children. You know, horror, fear, hilarity, urination. I mean, everything that is right in front of me if I can attend to it. And there's a depth at play that I never had before. You know, having children pushed me toward being a grown-up more than anything else did, including marriage. You know, and there are a million stories in the house. You know, Patrick has 4 novels at home. You know, and a brand new novel. This one. So there's a great line from Balzac who used to say, "Every child is one less novel written." I don't know. I think that you have to write about. I think you have to grapple with your family as a writer. I think you have to tell your family stories. But it is. I don't have any easy advice about it. There'll be people who are very offended in the way that you see them, or the way you choose to tell the story. That's not how it happened. You'll hear that a lot, especially from your husband. You know. I don't have any easy answer to that. Sorry. More. Yes, ma'am.
So, as writers, especially as young writers, you get a lot of feedback from a variety of people regarding
like how you can improve your writing. And one of my questions is, how do you balance developing your own voice and then not becoming a conglomerate, I guess? And how did you as a writer gain confidence in your own abilities? Because you have to balance confidence in your ability to write with the ability to take criticism or advice or to acknowledge, I have this habit and maybe it's not the best.
Actually, again, a very good question. The short answer is A, you have to listen to Patrick enough to pass the class. I guess after that it becomes a matter of partly publication. Publication is very confidence-making. When a piece does accept, when a magazine accepts a piece of yours, you feel like you pretty much knew what you were doing. And a lot of it too is just practice, I think. It may be, clearly there are certain tics in my writing, right? There are certain stylistic, and they're not conscious, by the way. Another thing I advise you is when anybody talks about your style, run screaming in the other direction. Style is something that you should never think about or talk about. Let other people talk about it for you. But I don't know, the answer sort of is to balance, is to listen and balance. Some creative criticism is very helpful indeed. There are some things that you're doing, if your work's not working for a reader, for one reason or another, you need to know that. I think there's a lot of fine writing that never gets read and never gets published. That's written in large part for catharsis by the writer. There are a lot of people who just want to get stuff out. Writing, of course, is a form of catharsis, probably first and foremost, right? But I don't have an easy answer. At this stage, you do listen to lots of people. I find writers' groups unnerving. I'm not in them, and I find them off-putting because I don't want too many people telling me how things are until I'm sure. You know what I mean? And this is the only advantage of being 48 rather than 28 is that I feel like I've been doing it long enough that I know if a piece is, if it has that sound, if the sound is bone true, it's okay. It's good enough for me. It may not be good enough for you, or you might not like it, but it was okay. I know it's okay for me. It's made out of real wood. And mostly that's just practice, I think. The more and more and more you do it, the more pieces you make, the more you'll hear yourself writing a true thing. Yeah.
Kind of going off that idea, I really liked your essay, What Matters, but it's kind of one of those things that the way it's written, it's almost like when you read it, you say, well, I could do that. It's just a list of things.
It's just a list.
But, there's something more to it, how it all kind of flows and then kind of the ending. Was that risky for you to write, or how did you know that it was worth it? Did you just sit down and start writing things that you like or that make you happy?
Actually, this is crucial. One of the things I wanted to put in your minds today, and have it come from the universe, not from me, is there's a lot of different ways to tell stories. Don't think about form. Don't worry about form. And don't worry about clean consistency of form. Sentences have to have subjects. No, they don't. They don't. What matters? A background there. What matters is a snippet of a novel. Like every other poor essayist in the world, writing a novel. David Duncan says, it's some kind of weird human thing. As soon as you're good at something, you don't want to do it. You want to do the thing that you're bad at. It's like really good ball players want to play baseball. Michael Jordan. But anyway, that's from a novel. And the question, a young man asks an older man, hey, what mattered in your life? And that's his answer, right? But I like to read that piece. For one thing, it's fun to read. But I like to show it to writers, especially because say, look, this piece is simple as can be. It's just a litany of things. But there's something else at play. You get the sense of who that guy is, right? Yes, of course, it's Brian Doyle at the end, but you have a sense of a character. This guy's telling you what mattered in his life, and you understand something about that man from the things he chooses to say, right? And even the way he says them. Thesauruses, walruses, castics, there's a humor and playfulness and depth and poignancy, and there's a weave there. But the form is, you couldn't get any more simple than that. It's just a long list. It's a litany, a chant, right? That's okay. That's okay. It really, in a way, I would argue, if we each had a pint of beer in front of us, I would argue, it's sort of an essay, isn't it? You could say, what? No, stupid. But I might argue that it is. Is it a profile? Is it a portrait? Maybe it is. So that works. So there are lots of different ways to tell a story. I think because we spend so much time learning form, we begin to think that form is important. No, it isn't. It's the content that's important. The story, the delivery is only an envelope. It's like prayer. the impulse is the prayer. The form is only an envelope that you mail the letter in, right? I mean, the fact that in my culture, for example, we say Hail Marys and Our Father. That's just form to get your mind into the repetitive musical respect of prayer. You know, the great Peter Matheson says, look, do you know why the Hindu and Buddhist cultures use the word Om? It's only to get yourself into the chant of your own heartbeat. That's what meditation is. Meditation is in 4/4 time, just like rock and roll. So yes, you two is the greatest spiritual band. Hey, Bono's a bright guy. More questions? Come on, I feel like I want to be of help. How can I help you? Can we talk about Aussie football now, for God's sake?
The question I want to ask, I hope to make sense, is do you think story will always win the day when it comes to publication? Will good story always win, or, because one of the questions, the reason why I ask it is we were just discussing, there seems to be a trend in creative nonfiction towards almost very dark and somber writing now. You know, they want real issues, and yet your writing is about life is actually not so bad. As tough as it is,
No.
as hard as it is.
Life's real hard. And there's suffering everywhere. Suffering is the meal that you eat 3 times a day. But if that's all, what kind of life is that?
So as long as you write a good story, you will always get published? Or do you think at some stage you're going
It's
to
like it's like a heavy moral question. Can you answer this with my Pat Madden hat? My short answer is yes. Yes. And I say that as a man and as a writer. Yes, a good story will win. And in fact, I don't think that other kinds of writing matter so much. You know, I mean, you can read a really, really, really dark story, but if it's cast as story, you know, there's a great piece for, you know, Barry Lopez. Everybody knows Barry Lopez, one of the great writers. Barry had a very enormously difficult childhood that he never spoke about until recently. He wrote a long piece about water, about the spiritual, restorative, about water. It was all about all kinds of angles on water. And in that piece, he finally talks about his enormously painful, horrific childhood. But he's casting the whole thing in the form of story. So to me, it was an act of courage. I thought, you know, it would be easy to write a memoir about how he was horribly abused as a child, but he writes it in a different way. He tells a story about it. Yes, I think so. In fact, I don't think anything else really matters. You know, and that's the food that we eat. That's who we are. Religion, citizenship, education, family life, romance. It's all exchange of story, right? I mean, that's who we are. You know, if you look at politics, politics is theatrical, yes, but it's also the provision and sale of story. You know, a very successful politician is one who's able to catch big ideas and big movements and tell them as stories. Right? I mean, as well, I don't want to drift into current politics, but some of those stories are true. Some are not. You know, I was when I heard Colin Powell give his testimony to the United Nations, I was convinced. I believed Colin Powell. He told a story that I thought was completely believable and true. You know, so I think he was just as shocked as everybody else to discover maybe it wasn't fully true. So anyway, how else can I help?
All the time as you got.
Is it it?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Well, thank you very much.
We didn't even go over the notes. I'm sorry.
For classwork, Ryan has a story here, or an essay for